Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, their.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss readings for Commemoration of the Holy Innocents, the first Sunday of Christmas, and Name of Jesus. While the pop culture understanding of Christmas ends on the 25th and is largely about family and presents, the religious holiday has very different themes and lasts for 12 days that begin on Christmas Day.
Professor Lupin wants to remind you to have lots of chocolate on hand for this first set of readings for this episode. The first set is an unusual commemoration that not all congregations use, the Holy Innocents. This set of readings includes a lot of discussion of child murder, colonization, genocide, and suicide. We also will be discussing adoption in the Gospel for the first Sunday of Christmas.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch, hpatchurch.wordpress.com, and you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
The Commemoration of the Holy Innocents is on December 28th.
One of the main themes of the Commemoration of the Holy Innocents is the way the powerful and those in power are threatened by babies and by ones who are very vulnerable. In our gospel reading especially, we see this come up with Herod and baby Jesus. At the beginning of Exodus in the Bible, we see this happen with Pharaoh and Moses as a baby. And in Harry Potter, that is where our story begins, is with Voldemort, who is said to be so powerful, being so threatened by the potential of the baby who is Harry.
Our first reading is from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 15 through 17. The prophet Jeremiah mourns the loss of the northern kingdom of Israel through the metaphor of Rachel weeping at the loss of Joseph and Benjamin, but also foretells God returning them from exile.
So one of the main themes that came up for me in this passage was grief paired with hope. I think it's certainly the beginning half of the passage is all about grief, but in those 3 verses, we get a progression of, yes, there is space for grief, and there is this hope that we will not always be grieving. And I was thinking about the different ways that grief come up in Harry Potter, and a lot of the time grief and anger go together, or grief and silence. But I was struck by the scene that we have at Shell Cottage when Harry is burying Dobby, and we get to experience with him this deep, deep grief at Dobby's death and this hope and sense of purpose for what needs to come and this clarity for what he needs to do moving forward.
Often, when we talk about a mother and a boy child and death, our minds immediately jump to Lily in the Harry Potter books. And I can see why. But in this case, now I realize that Jeremiah is using Rachel and her children as a metaphor, but some folks may be looking for someone to compare Rachel to as a historical character. And I would really suggest not comparing her to Lily, though there is a impulse to do that, I can see. Thinking of Lily fearing for Harry in the last moments of her life. But in that case, it's Lily and not Harry who dies, and Harry lives because of what Lily did. And interestingly, in this passage, it's not Rachel's effort that brings her children home. It's God's gift that brings them back from exile. It's God that brings them back. And so I'm not really sure that that's a good parallel to use.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, and we don't actually get, in the Harry Potter books, we don't get mothers whose children die in the same way.
I mean, Molly loses Fred, but it's not
Right, but that's a little bit different. But what did come up for me was at the end of Deathly Hallows when um, after Voldemort tries to kill Harry, and they're bringing him back, and they're supposed to be the conquering group, and um, when the crowd of people who are the survivors of the resistance, um, when they see everybody coming and they see Harry in Hagrid's arms, um, there's this terrible, terrible scream of no that Harry hears. And then we hear Harry, as the narrator, say, "The scream was the more terrible because he had never expected or dreamed that Professor McGonagall could make such a sound." And that just struck me as so fitting
Yeah.
for Rachel crying out in grief.
No, I'd agree with that. That moment is very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And you can definitely imagine Dame Maggie Smith with that too. She would have done a great job. Yeah. I don't think they included it in the movie.
No, the second Deathly Hallows movie was really just this extended made up battle scene that never actually occurred. Not that I have strong feelings about it.
When we reach verse 15, Jeremiah's being poetic here. He's not actually talking about Rachel weeping for Joseph and Benjamin. He's talking about the defeat of the northern kingdom of Israel, as opposed to the southern kingdom, also known as Judah, which continued, obviously, for those familiar with their biblical history. But this is like how when Trelawney talks about the Grimm, Harry eventually finds out this means that he is not, in fact, getting a pet dog, sadly, but instead he's going to die. So,
Or it's the reverse, and Trelawney talking about the Grimm as Harry's going to die ends up meaning not that he's going to die, but instead get a dog father. I'm so funny.
welcome to Harry Potter at Church, where we introduce you to all of the ancient jokes of fandom.
So good, so good. In verse 15, when it talks about Rachel refusing to be comforted, I thought about Harry after Sirius's death, where Harry gets transported back to right into Dumbledore's office, and when Dumbledore gets there, Harry just starts to destroy everything he can in the office, and just will not hear, won't hear a positive word about Snape, won't hear a positive, right? It is just so overcome with grief.
I'd always assumed that some of that isn't. I mean, it's not just Sirius's death that's hitting him. Then, it's kind of like he's also mourning his parents, because for the first time he had a shot at a parental relationship that was good, and so now when Sirius dies, it's not just that he's mourning Sirius as a person or Sirius as his godfather, but he's mourning the fact that this means he's never going to get to have that relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it, and I think also there's all of the pressure, right? He's
Yeah.
had a year of having PTSD and not dealing with it, and then a
Because
year of,
the wizarding world doesn't believe in therapy.
right, um, and then a year of Umbridge, and just the culmination of all of this stress and pressure.
Yeah.
In the second half of this passage, when God is telling the metaphorical Rachel to keep her voice from weeping and keep her eyes from tears, it reminded me again of that scene in Deathly Hallows when Voldemort is coming back and has tried to kill Harry and doesn't know that it didn't work and wants everyone to automatically just join in. But, and so Voldemort like silences the crowd and blocks the crowd and all of these things, and his spells aren't working because of Harry's sacrifice. And Neville ends up rushing forward, and Voldemort stops him and then says, "And who is this?" Voldemort said in his soft snake's hiss. "Who has volunteered to demonstrate what happens to those who continue to fight when the battle is lost?" Voldemort tries to recruit Neville because he's a pureblood, and Neville says, "I'll join you when hell freezes over," says Neville. "Dumbledore's army!" And just yells, and there's this hope that Neville embodies, even when everything, all of the
Right.
evidence is to the contrary. All evidence says there's no hope left, and yet Neville embodies that hope. And the breaking of the silencing charms embody that hope, right? They say it's not over yet. It's not complete silence yet.
And I know J.K. Rowling has said that Neville got more of a backstory, or Neville got more of a role in the later books than she kind of expected. He sort of took over, and as happens when you're writing fiction sometimes. And she had actually meant to give us more of Dean's backstory. And I do wonder, I don't know that she's made any statements about this, but I've always kind of figured that some of that was because Matthew Lewis, the actor who played Neville in the movies, turned out to be really good. And he turned in a very evocative performance.
Yeah, but I don't know that I would chalk it up to that just because she was so far along with the books by the time.
Right. Not entirely.
She wasn't I think done with them, but
yeah,
I think racism also probably had something to do with it.
Yeah.
But I do
love, especially when it comes to the movies.
But. Yeah. Oh, for sure. But I do love the way that Neville does come into his own and becomes this beacon of hope.
Right.
In a way that everybody thinks that only Harry can be.
Yeah.
Our second reading for the Commemoration of the Holy Innocents is from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. The author of this letter reassures the early church in the face of their persecution, reminding them of their faithful choice to follow Jesus. So one of the things that comes up here, and that comes up really well in this passage, is suffering for a purpose, right? The author is very clear that it's not just good for everyone who suffers or everyone to suffer, but that the suffering that people are experiencing is because of their faith in Christ and because of the love of God that we know of in Jesus. And so there's this sense of purpose for the suffering. And I think about that with Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix, that whenever they suffered, whenever they struggled, whenever they were killed, there was a sense that it was for a greater purpose, right? Sirius has this conversation, particularly with Fred and George, but with all of the Weasleys when Arthur is in St. Mungo's. But then to compare that, especially on this day, with babies and kids being asked to sacrifice, and the injustice that's not.
And they didn't actually get asked. Like, It wasn't voluntary. Yeah.
Right. Harry's name was down.
We'll get to that story in a minute.
Born, but later. But yeah. And just that juxtaposition of who willingly does something and, right, where is their informed consent and where is there not.
Yeah, from the very beginning of this passage, you start reading these verses, and usually, at least historically in this podcast especially, we're not really all that fond of verses that are about glory and suffering, right? And Paul is not the most pastoral of the biblical authors, let's put it that way. And that may be the understatement of the year. So I start reading this passage and I say to myself, oh no, here he goes again. But instead, this passage turns out to be different because it goes to a better place. This passage is about suffering that you've brought on yourself by following Christ directly. It's not that bad things are just happening to you that you can't control. I would also like to point out that this passage is not saying that the goal of following Christ is to suffer for Christ. That's not the point either. No, we're not masochists. But sometimes this happens to Christians. Sometimes this happens to people of any ethical or moral system. If you're going to choose to follow a particular understanding of how to live, sometimes you're going to be faced with the choice between the easy option and the right option. And this is a struggle that people of any religion or lack thereof would be familiar with. And for Christians, it tends to show up when we have the option to either do what Christ would ask of us, do what Christ is calling us to, being kind and generous and loving in the face of a lack thereof, instead of following our natural impulses and being selfish. The thing about suffering for Christ, though, is that there's always a way out. That's the difference between this kind of thing and suffering that's happening to you that you can't control, like living through a famine or not, or being a baby and a king decides to
kill you.
Which again, we'll get to that story in a minute. When you're suffering for Christ, it's voluntary. You can take the easy option to get out of it, but you choose not to because it might be unpleasant, but it's the right thing to do. And when I think about someone in the Harry Potter books who did something like that, the first name that comes to mind is Regulus Black. He did not have to die the way that he did. He could have continued being his mother's son. He could have taken the easy way and followed everybody's expectations, but he did not. Instead, he did the right thing. And nobody says that that's going to lead to an easy life. Nobody says that that's going to lead to rewards.
I mean, look at Jesus.
Yeah. But he did the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
This feels like I should be making a reference to the Good Place TV show, and I would, but we reference other fandoms often enough that I don't.
And I have no idea about the Good Place TV show.
Oh, it is. You'd like it.
I think I've seen it pop up, but I haven't. Yeah.
It's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so as you were talking about that, the thing that I thought of with sharing in Christ's suffering and the ways that we join with Christ when we suffer for our faith, which is not an experience that we have a lot in the U.S., but as Christians, but throughout history.
Yeah, usually for American Christians, it's less suffering in the terrifying ways and more just life is more difficult than it has to be because you're doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. But the thing that I thought about was Neville and the rest of the DA and those who are at Hogwarts in Deathly Hallows, and the ways, right, they're described as giving the Carrows so much trouble, but they, in their resistance at Hogwarts, they are sharing in Harry's suffering and they are sharing in Harry's struggle, even though they're in a different place and context, but it's still sharing in that together.
Yeah.
Verse 15 I have some issues with because it says, let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even a mischief maker. And I get, like, don't kill people, don't steal from people, don't, commit criminal crimes, but don't make mischief? Like...
Well, no, when we read this passage, this verse, I was thinking it was saying that when you suffer, understand it's not the same kind of suffering as a murderer or a mischief maker. This is not suffering that you've brought upon yourself because you've done something bad. This is suffering that you've brought upon yourself because you've done something good. And the way that we deal emotionally with suffering often comes from where did that suffering come from? When you're dealing with suffering that you have, it's natural disaster, you deal with that emotionally different than you deal with, well, yeah, okay, what I did earlier was stupid and wrong, and this consequence makes sense, versus what happens when you're saying to yourself, okay, this sucks, but on the other hand, I'm still glad I made that choice,
Yeah, that makes more sense, although it still casts mischief-making as a negative thing. And I think mischief-making can be a holy thing and can be actually following Christ, right? Sometimes I think of the Holy Spirit as the holy mischief maker, right?
Yes, and goodness knows I have cast the Holy Spirit in that role as well. But
right. And so then it lifts up like Fred and George's. They are definitely holy mischief makers in Order of the Phoenix with Umbridge. Right? Like the mischief they make is
I'm on board with that.
Resist.
But I also kind of wonder their motivations. I mean, it's hard from the way the books are written to not like Fred and George, but on the other hand, we also have things like there's that bit in one of the early books where they're hissing at first-year Slytherins as, fourth years at that point. There's the fact that they seem to actually profit quite a bit off the war. Like, I'm not really clear, but do they sell their stuff to the Order of the Phoenix, or do they give it to them? You know, it's not.
I imagine that they would
And
provide their stuff to the Order of the Phoenix for free because they're part of the Order of the Phoenix by then.
yeah, it's not. I don't know. And some of the stuff they do is not like the stuff they do to Neville. Neville is not a willing participant in testing their
I
items
agree.
on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, and I think that's
So,
part
like,
of the way that they grow, right? Like it's distinct for me around book 5. That's when they get let in on the big secrets of Voldemort coming back and the ways that Voldemort is coming back. And so then that I feel like that is part of their own the way that they switch on their own is to be like, okay, what does it actually mean? Right? Their vocation is
right.
mischief making. And so what does that mean in light of
How can we help? Yeah, and I'm on board with some of that. It's just I also think that their giving trouble to Umbridge is not entirely altruistic. I mean, it's not like they're not having fun. It's not like they wouldn't be doing this even if Umbridge wasn't like actively evil and was just an irritating teacher. You know?
they would not I don't think that they would be doing it to nearly the extent that they are. And nobody says that doing something for the right reasons can't be fun.
Yeah, no, I can see that, but Holy Mischief Maker is quite the title. I don't think we can cast them as the Holy Spirit in action.
I'm not
Let's put that way.
I'm not trying to cast them as the Holy Spirit in action.
Okay.
I do think that there is a parallel between the ways I think about the Holy Spirit as the Holy Mischief Maker, and some of the things that they do in the sense of like all of us. The Holy Spirit works through all of us.
Right.
So I think some of the mischief that they do is holy. It is for a good purpose. It is for a purpose that is larger than themselves.
Yeah, I could see that. And then when we reach the last few verses of this section, so we've already said that this passage is about how suffering because of Christ is not the same as suffering because of sin. And I kind of think about the Harry Potter books, and I think to myself, Harry was rich. Like we find out in the first book, he has this whole giant mound of gold in the family Gringotts vault. He could have coasted through school and ignored all the Voldemort stuff. He didn't have to keep going back and fighting Voldemort. I mean, we don't really know how things would have turned out if he had done that. Maybe Voldemort would or wouldn't have come back and taken over anyway. I don't know. But he could have, if everything worked out, he could have just coasted through school and not done all that fighting and gotten a cushy job at the ministry because he was the boy who lived, and that would make good PR, and goodness knows Cornelius Fudge would have loved that. But over and over again in the books, he chose to fight, he chose to help, and that caused him so much suffering. And that's an extraordinary example of what this passage means. Also, when I read these last couple verses, I like to point out that it doesn't actually say in these verses what happens to those who don't obey God. It just implies that they might be more difficult to save, but it doesn't say that they're not saved.
Right.
So there's plenty of room for grace in this passage.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we read into it our own desires for clarity and judgment and
Right. Our third reading is Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 18. This is the story of the massacre of the Holy Innocents. While we're not sure whether this actually happened, by including this story, the gospel makes clear that Herod will massacre babies to save himself and sees Jesus as a legitimate threat.
So, although the overarching theme for the day is powerful being threatened by babies and by the vulnerable, the specific way that Herod is depicted as getting upset when the Magi don't return to tell him about where the baby is and who the baby is reminded me of this sense of powerful people being especially upset when they're tricked or when somebody pulls the wool over their eyes. And that reminded me I'm on a Deathly Hallows kick, and I'm still just reading Order of the Phoenix, which is weird. But it reminded me of Voldemort in Deathly Hallows right after the break-in at Gringotts, when he gets the news that Harry and Ron and Hermione escaped Gringotts and broke in and like stole something and escaped. And you can, the movie depicts it really well, but also Harry sees it in his mind,
Right.
flashes to it, and it's just Voldemort killing, like massacring anyone within reach, and like the
Right.
Malfoys are running to save themselves, of course, and um, but everyone, there's so much blood and death all around him because he's just so pissed and he can't handle his own emotions.
Right. Again, the wizarding world does not believe in therapy.
I know, but there's like so many parallels today.
Yeah. Now, many people have wondered why this passage is included in the Bible, especially when we're not sure whether this was actually a historical event or not. Many colleagues have also wondered why we bother including this passage in the lectionary, because let me tell you, this is not a fun one to preach.
I love preaching on this one, and technically, you don't have to preach on it.
I know. Well, I've always been of the opinion that if you're going to preach and you have a set of texts and you ignore the really troublesome one that the congregation is going to be really confused and unhappy about, then frankly, you're not doing your job.
That is true. I just meant that like it's not a Sunday text, so you
Right.
don't have to.
No, unless December 28th happens to land on a Sunday, in which case you have the option to do this, you don't have to. And even then, you don't have to. But anyway, so a lot of people wonder why on earth we have this story. And while we're at it, I'd like to point out that the word used for babies or children in this passage has often been translated as meaning baby boys only. But the the word itself doesn't specify gender. So whether or not this happened, the text assumes that Herod felt just as threatened by baby girls as much as baby boys, not knowing perhaps what gender Jesus was. So whether or not this story actually happened, the text assumes that Herod felt just as threatened by baby girls as by baby boys, which implies the gospel author doesn't think that God incarnating as a woman is completely impossible, which I like.
Woot.
This is a horrific story, whether or not it happened. Just reading it can ruin your day. But it also makes clear just how important Jesus was. Herod is willing to have a whole town of people who hate him forever, right? If this actually happened, or even if it didn't, and we're just kind of trying to describe what kind of person Herod is. But they wouldn't have been that fond of him anyway. But this would have been a whole new low for any leader, because even the people who don't have children themselves will be forever angry about this. It's an extraordinary thing to do. But he's willing to do this in hopes of getting rid of Jesus. Just like Voldemort, choosing to go after Harry rather than Neville made it clear that he considered Harry and not Neville his enemy, and was willing to try to kill an infant to do so.
I also was thinking about this in relationship to everything going on in our country and in the world, and with families that were separated this last summer at the border, and children who are still being kept separate from their parents
Right.
and their family, and the ways that, I mean, we can say that it is not okay to do this to anyone, but when you do it to children, there's just this extra level of horror, and
Yeah.
it's just so baffling, especially like as a Christian and as a pastor, and like to think that you would take kids away from their families at such a young age, or like we hear of Herod, kill people, kill babies.
There's actually, to connect it to a TV show, there's a show called The Orville, which is not exactly great cinematic history or anything. They're basically making fun of Star Trek. But there's an episode where a couple of characters are on a ship of the enemy, and they discover that the enemy is going to basically massacre an entire planet of innocent people, and so they have to stop them. And the only way they come up with to do that will involve killing everyone on board. And then they discover that, but it's a warship, so they figure these people are military. They knew the risks when they went in. Then they discover that this alien race that is trying to massacre this planet has rather different methods of going about things than they do, and they have a whole classroom of children on board learning how to
Mm-hmm.
become military officers. Like, they look like they're the equivalent of human 10-year-olds. And so they say to themselves, well, we can't kill the kids, can we? So they manage to trap the kids in one room together so that they aren't affected by how this all goes down. And afterwards, one of the adults, their teacher, is actually saved with them. That was it. They had to do that, as it worked out. And the captain goes up to her afterwards and explains that the kids are going to be returned to their families, and she's probably going to have to go through some kind of judicial process, but he doesn't really know how that's going to work, but she won't be hurt. And she says, why did you save them? Because in her race, killing the children totally would have been on the table. And his reply is, they weren't my enemy, they're children. And her reply is, they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't help but think of this
Right.
in terms of this, because goodness knows that town was going to hate Herod forever now. And when you kill a child, it's, for us, it that takes you to a level that no one is ever going to want to deal with you again. I mean, there's a reason why they made that Anakin Skywalker's major turning point of truly becoming evil in the Star Wars series, because that's something you can't come back from.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a serious, right? There's so much trauma that happens, and then you need to, like, all of that stuff. I also am struck each year. The commemoration of the Holy Innocents is on December 28th, and December 29th is the commemoration of the massacre at Wounded Knee,
Yeah,
where the United States government killed people of all genders, people of all ages at
yeah,
Wounded Knee, which is in what is now known as South Dakota, but the
right.
Lakota people. And the ways that colonialism and colonization and white settlers in this country have killed and really attempted genocide
Yeah,
of native peoples. And thank God we failed, but we're still, right, the government still does this as they renegotiate who, right, they challenge the Indian Child Welfare Act, and so
yeah,
native children can be placed in non-native homes without as much protection, so they lose their culture, and it is a cultural genocide.
yeah. It's not all that different from the residential schools in
Mm-hmm.
history. Yeah,
Yeah, and so that's another way, right, that we, like you were talking about with the show, that when we do these things to children, we take away their hope. We take away the possibility of a future. We cause so much trauma in their young lives that, I mean, you have to wonder how they even get out of it or climb back. And that's part of the reality that the
and the
rate.
level of care and work and effort needed to help them
Mm-hmm.
get
And
anything back from
yeah,
that. Yeah,
and if you look at rates of suicide among Native people, especially Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations, which are Lakota
yeah,
reservations, like, it's so high because we've tried our best to take away all of their hope. On a more hopeful tone, verse 13, where an angel comes to Joseph in a dream and tells him to take the family and flee to Egypt because Herod's going to kill them all, or try to, reminded me of Snape's warning to Dumbledore, albeit with different consequences. But Snape tries to warn Dumbledore to protect Lily and
right.
Harry, and therefore even James. Um, that it's kind of a convoluted warning, but it is this warning of there is
Yeah,
danger coming and someone wants this baby dead. Go save yourselves. And at the end of verse 15, we get that part of the flight to Egypt was, in Matthew's terms and in Matthew's perspective, to fulfill what was said, out of Egypt I have called my son. And I was thinking about Harry, like, out of Surrey I have called my son to Hogwarts.
so we reach verse 16, and earlier in Matthew, it says that the Magi took the long way back home, basically, trying to. They did not go back to Herod directly, and sent messengers back to him instead, because they did not want to be the bearers of bad news, because with Herod that historically did not work out well. And so this is why when the time for Herod's decision to slaughter the children of Bethlehem comes, he says ages 2 and under, because it's been a while. Jesus is probably a year or two old now. Though it's never explained why the family is still in Bethlehem after having come there for the census instead of having gone back home afterwards, which I thought was odd. But
maybe they received such great hospitality when they were welcomed into
the stable.
Yes, the non.
Well, we don't actually know it was a stable. I know.
Like,
yeah.
Home.
Sure. Maybe Joseph got work there as a carpenter. Who knows?
Yeah.
But
building an actual stable.
Possibly. Or maybe just more mangers.
Yeah. Those also not wood. There was an article. Somebody posted an article and it was really great, and I can link to it. But it challenges the ideas of stables and mangers, the way that we think of them and the way that we portray them in our Christmas pageants and nativities.
Yeah, no, a lot of the details that we have are ones that we've made up over the years. Some of them are more ridiculous than others. And one of my favorite examples is that in the Quran, which does mention Jesus' birth, Jesus is born under a palm tree. So I always thought that was an interesting detail. To get back to Harry Potter, which we probably should do at some point here.
Someone has to.
Yeah. The Magi wandering off in sort of the wrong direction and deciding to go home instead of going to Herod reminds me of Harry and Hermione, and generally speaking Ron, wandering in the forest of Dean, which it took me the world's longest time to figure out that that's actually a place in Britain, and that we weren't saying that Dean, the character, Dean Thomas, had a forest.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Weird. Yeah, it would. Kind of surprising given what he's told us about his background, but I suppose you never know. Mm-hmm. But they're wandering because they don't really have a better plan, and that kind of sounds like the Magi to me, which makes you wonder just how wise they are. But as somebody once put it to me, back then they had wise men. It's been 2,000 years. Now we're just down to wise guys.
And also, the Magi were like wizards, basically. But we should definitely include that in our Epiphany thing. Yeah.
More on that later.
Mm-hmm.
There is actually a little bit of, depth and nuance to that. We're not just, yeah.
What? For the first Sunday of Christmas, which falls on December 30th this year, our first reading is from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 18 through 20 and 26, with some missing verses included in our links, but not included in the lectionary. Hannah continues to visit and provide clothes for her son Samuel, whom she committed to God's service, and is blessed by Eli and continues to bear more children through God's gift. So I was thinking about this theme of blessings and prayers and wondering if that happens in Harry Potter. And I thought that maybe it would, but I was trying to think of all of the places where it would happen, and strangers would come up and greet Harry when he was a kid, but they wouldn't bless him. And
no. Yeah.
Ginny, when they break up and when Ginny knows that Harry's going off to do some silly noble thing.
Yeah.
I thought that maybe she would say, well, be safe or whatever, but she didn't, because she knows he's not going to be safe, right?
This is Harry we're talking about. We all knew that.
And, and it's Ginny, right? She's not going to just do some...
She's pissed she's not coming with. Yeah.
Probably. And she's not going to just, say, oh, don't do anything wrong because I love you, because she's not that kind of a person.
No.
But yeah, so I couldn't really think of any places where there are clear blessings. I don't know.
Okay. I don't know that they're actually spoken. But I mean, we've talked before about Molly essentially adopting Harry, and it seemed like every time that she did something nice for him or fed him or something like that, she gave him a lot of blessings. A lot of people give Harry blessings, but in terms of does anyone bless him, we've also talked about the sign at Godric's Hollow where people wrote best wishes for him. I think that's going to come up in a later reading as well. And those are sort of blessings, maybe not directly to Harry, but I think they kind of fall under that category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about Lily in Goblet of Fire during Priori Incantatem. I'm wondering if there was a blessing there. She kind of just says, like, hang on, wait for your dad, and then get to the port key as fast as you can.
And does James say anything that's a blessing? And Dumbledore says a lot of wise things to Harry, but I don't think a blessing is exactly one of them.
Yeah, I don't think he does either.
I mean, we could certainly say that Lily sacrificing herself for Harry, that's definitely a blessing, and it protects him for the rest of his life. Well, for several years.
Yeah, nobody blesses him in Priori Incantatem. Like, Cedric asks him to take the body back. In the original version, which is what I have of the books, Harry's dad comes out before Harry's mom. And
right,
so Harry's dad is the one who says, wait, your mom's coming. She wants to see you. Which is hilarious because Lily was killed after. It gets
the order wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, so not a lot of blessing. I mean, like, happy birthdays and many happy returns and stuff, but...
If anyone was going to bless him, I would expect it to either be Luna or Hermione.
Or Hagrid.
Yeah.
Hagrid could go.
I don't think Luna does.
No.
I kind of wonder about Hermione's birthday gifts, if any of them kind of came with...
I mean, people say happy birthday and those sorts of...
Christmas gifts or things. Yeah.
I mean, maybe in Chamber of Secret... No. In Sorcerer's Stone, when Hermione is telling Harry that he has to go on, that's in some ways a blessing.
Right. And when Ron sends them on after the chess game. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. In Sorcerer's
Also,
Stone.
If any of our wonderful listeners can think of any examples of blessings in the Harry Potter books, people being blessed or people being given blessings, please do let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, let us know. Or if you have blessings, we'll take those as well.
Whether they're for us or not.
Right. So one note, one of the verses that is left out of this passage that I am upset is left out is verse 21, where it finally says that Hannah got to have more kids, right? She had one kid and she had her first kid, Samuel, and gave Samuel to God's service. And so Samuel was living there and working there and with Eli and not with Hannah. And she came to visit and stuff, but didn't live together. And then Eli gives her these blessings when she comes. And Hannah gets more kids, which is really exciting and made me think about the different times and places where women's voices and experiences get lost or left out. And in this case, her experience is lost and left out specifically by the lectionary, right? Like, it's in there. It's in the Bible. It says that she has more kids, which is something she has longed for.
But this passage isn't entirely about her. It's about her and Samuel. And so they decided to not include that.
Yeah, which is annoying.
Yeah. No, when we think about women and their voices and experiences being lost, I think the obvious example in this passage is that Elkanah has another wife who is a perfectly ordinary person. She's not, like, evil or anything.
I mean,
she's just not Hannah.
Kind. She's mean to Hannah when she can't get pregnant. She's super mean.
Right, but that...
She's not evil, you're right.
Yeah, she's not evil. And frankly, the kind of meanness that's shown in that story, if I remember correctly, not terribly unusual. But...
I mean, I think it's kind of a jealousy thing, similar to Sarah and Sarah treating Hagar.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think that it was...
difference.
I don't think she was mean because because Hannah couldn't have kids. I think she was mean because Elkanah was so incredibly obvious about preferring Hannah to her. And frankly, that wasn't very kind of Elkanah either.
Mm-hmm. And the only way that the only recourse she had was to point out the child bearing.
Yeah, that was just a mess of family systems.
Mm-hmm.
But I also realize, of course, when we think about Harry Potter, we don't get a lot of Hannah Abbott's voice either in the books, do we? Or for that matter, really any Hufflepuffs other than Tonks, which I'm still kind of irritated about. But she does show up much more in the fanworks.
I bet. Yeah, I love Hannah. She's one of my favorites. But we don't.
Anytime she shows up, she always seems to be the voice of reason.
Also, I was thinking about the ways that Harry hears a lot, especially in the first half of the books, about his dad and the Marauders, but doesn't hear much about his mom, aside from that he has her eyes, until much, much later, that he doesn't hear about what life was like, and the only ways he gets that is through actually Snape's memories, mostly. And that's like one of the main characters in his life, whose story he doesn't hear as much, or gets left out of the lectionary, but is still there, and eventually he digs around and finds it.
Yeah, looking back, I can see why Sirius and Remus would have focused on James, obviously. Mm-hmm. But when they were thinking about telling Harry about his dad, they couldn't mention his mom a few times.
Right?
Yeah.
And
I get that they weren't as close to her, but still.
Yeah. She was super awesome. And in verse 18 of the text that we actually get to read for the lectionary, Samuel sounds like a house elf to me. Like
he really does.
Serving and, super happy to serve and all of those things. And gets his ephod made by his mom, and which, according to Google, is a sleeveless garment worn by Jewish priests. So I was thinking that it might be a tea cozy.
Just a really, really long tea cozy, yes.
Mm-hmm. Verse 19 reminded me, and the gift of that Hannah gives of the ephod reminded me of Neville and his mom in Order of the Phoenix over Christmas break, when they're all at St. Mungo's and they see Neville with his parents, and Neville's mom gives him Drooble's best blowing gum wrappers.
That was so sad.
And it's just this, especially if you don't read that Hannah gets more kids later, but this like bittersweet thing of like this gift that obviously means something to her, and it means something to Neville because it means something to her, but it's also just, there's this sadness in the ways their relationship is broken, the ways that their relationship is not what it maybe could have been, and thinking about Hannah and Samuel, that their relationship is different than it would have been if she didn't have trouble conceiving, and yet there's this like sweetness of her making this for him every single year and coming to see him.
Yeah. In verse 26, just to have a fun literary moment, this phrasing is called verse 26 is called a zeugma, when the word growing is used both in reference to stature and favor. It's using the same word in two different ways, which is a zeugma. One of my favorite examples of a zeugma is from a Tumblr post, which we will link to in the notes, that goes, "He fell from her favor and the window." I think that's fabulous. So if anyone has found any zeugmas in the Harry Potter canon, we would love to know about it. I have not been able to find any yet, but this seems like the sort of thing that J.K. Rowling would have had some fun with. So if you do find any, please let us know.
Yes, and my favorite from that same Tumblr post is "Our teeth and ambitions are bared," because it's from
that was a good one.
"Be prepared" from The Lion King.
Our next reading is from Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 17. The closest that the New Testament comes to giving Christians a dress code, we are instructed to clothe ourselves with love above all, and do all things in the name of Christ.
Is the author of Colossians a Hufflepuff? Because this seems so Hufflepuffy.
I do love this passage, and I do agree that this passage is very Hufflepuffy. Hufflepuffian? Hufflepuffish?
Ooh, Hufflepuffish!
That sounds good. But I also remember that there are some bits of Colossians that don't sound very Hufflepuffish at all, especially the women must cover their heads verse when prophesying and praying. That makes clear that not all people are truly equal, which is really not a Hufflepuff thing to say at all.
That is true.
I do think, however, that the authors of the Gospels are much more likely to be Hufflepuffs.
We did this once. We went through and said which.
Yes.
Because not all of them, right?
Not all of them.
You can actually pick which ones.
Matthew's kind of
probably go more for which on our blog. So you can check out our answers to those questions on our blogs in our About section. Or you can tell us what you think. Tweet at us or comment on Facebook.
Absolutely.
And speaking of Hufflepuffs, one of the themes that came up for me in this is just the warm fuzziness that this passage just feels so comforting and encouraging and be your best self. And that also reminded me of the Hogwarts theme song. Hogwarts, 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 teach us something, please. Whether we be old and bald or young with scabby knees, our heads could do with filling with some interesting stuff. For now they're bare and full of air, dead flies and bits of fluff. So teach us things worth knowing, bring back what we forgot. Just do your best, we'll do the rest, and learn until our brains all rot. Which of course is sung in whatever tune you want.
Right.
And Fred and George.
Except in the movies.
Except in the movies. But Fred and George sing it to a dirge in Sorcerer's Stone. I've sung more on this podcast than I ever thought I would sing by myself publicly ever in the history of ever.
We're very proud.
Thank you. It's my Gryffindor. It's the Gryffindor
Absolutely.
Me being bold, brave.
It says, make a joyful noise unto the Lord.
I'm good at joyful.
Absolutely. And noise.
And noise. Yeah. Yeah, so just the ways that the Hogwarts song is kind of an encouraging, we've forgotten stuff, we want to learn, we're gonna learn stuff, we're gonna try, and you're gonna try, and
we're all in this together.
Yeah, all in this. Wow, I need to so much singing. And now back from our brief intermission for our musical stylings. Verse 13, when the author of Colossians talks about bearing with one another and forgiving each other, I feel like the trio basically is doing this all the time. They are constantly bearing with each other, and they have to forgive, right? This is just the only way they survive. They're not
teenagers.
Always great at it, but
of course they do stupid and terrible things and misunderstand each other all the time. That's what being a teenager means. So they have to forgive each other. Mm-hmm. Although it does often take them a while, which is realistic enough.
That is very,
certainly.
Very true.
I appreciated that J.K. Rowling made some of those take some time and mean something, because so often in books written for young people, forgiveness gets turned into this fake thing, and she did not do that.
Yeah, especially in Deathly Hallows when Ron finally makes it back. It takes a while for Hermione to forgive him.
But I don't know that we can ever forgive someone as thoroughly and completely as God forgives us. That's not really a human thing.
True. We can strive and we can respond to God's forgiveness by trying our best to forgive others, but God is way better at it.
Right.
And has much more experience with it.
Well, yes, being immortal will do that for you.
Verse 14, when the author of Colossians talks about clothing yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, I was thinking about it, and it feels almost like love binding everything together is the moral of the books. It always comes back to love for why
Which
Harry
is why
survived.
Hufflepuffs are really the most important. For those of you who can't see Emily making that face at me right now, that was a very
Side-eye.
bemused and patient look. I think patient is a good word for it, yes.
There was a fair amount of side-eye going on.
In a more practical sense, this phrase also reminded me of the school uniforms in Harry Potter, which in the books, they sound nice and warm, and they're described as robes, and these kids are in, northern Scotland, where it's really freaking cold in the winter, so that makes sense. But then in the movies, and also like the app games and so on, the school uniforms basically become muggle clothes that are under a loose open cape kind of thing. And the girls are all wearing knee-length skirts and tights. And in frigid Scottish winter, that sounds like a terrible idea. I had enough experience as a kid waiting for the school bus in Illinois winter with the poor kids that went to Catholic school, and they had to wear uniforms, and the girls were all in knee-length skirts and tights. And in winter, they would freeze. It was terrible.
At least get some insulated
And
tights.
the rules for what they were allowed to wear were really bizarrely strict. Like, I asked if they were allowed to get leg warmers, and apparently not. Or at least they couldn't wear them once they got to school. I never understood why they didn't wear them waiting for the bus. But anyway, seriously, let's clothe these kids in some love and wool and Gore-Tex, please. When we reach verse 16, and I think that this is especially appropriate given the conversation Emily and I just had about our musical interlude. But when we read these books, Hogwarts, especially in the book version of canon, which doesn't even have the frog choir that makes an appearance in the movies, is deeply lacking in music. There is no orchestra or band. There is no choir in the books. There's like one radio station for magical people that we see the entire time. I mean, I suppose you can extrapolate. They'd have a couple. And goodness knows Britain is not known for having an enormous number of options for media. But there's no musical education at Hogwarts. There's no students we see playing musical instruments on their own or like practicing in the dorms.
Right, where did the Weird Sisters and Celestina Warbeck learn it all?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are they all Muggleborns? Is music more of a Mugglish thing? And do the Weird Sisters play electric guitars? Music is such a central part of how the church has grown and emotionally processed stuff and stayed together and made our bonds to each other better. It's such a part of how we worship and how we see ourselves. And especially for Lutherans, congregational singing is what we're known for, because it's part of how we do worship together. Worship isn't just something you go watch. It's not a concert. Instead, singing together helps you realize that worship is something that everyone in the room is creating together. So this whole total lack of music at Hogwarts seems wildly alien to me, because that was such an important part of my life, and especially my faith life as a kid.
And for me, as someone who has not really been, I've done some music and I learned a couple instruments growing up, but it was never something I was great at, and it was never something that I was really encouraged to do. I didn't even notice that there was no music at Hogwarts. Like, did not even cross my mind that anybody would want music.
In my childhood, I think music took the place of sports. Because so many people will talk about learning teamwork through sports, and I never wanted to. I never had any interest, but I learned a lot of teamwork through choir, because the point of a choir is to blend all your voices together, and nobody, unless you have a solo, is supposed to stand out. So you're working together on, and not like trying to showboat, right? And I think I learned more about teamwork through music than I ever would have through sports.
Our gospel for this Sunday is Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. Jesus' family of origin participated in the Passover festival each year, and when Jesus was 12, he stayed in the temple, listening and asking questions, until his frightened parents found him and brought him back to Nazareth to continue growing and learning.
We don't know that Jesus and his family went to the temple every year, so we don't know if this is Jesus in a place that he's comfortable in, or Jesus in a place that he hasn't physically been before. It's quite a trip. And even with assuming that Joseph was more of a artisan than a laborer as a trained carpenter, it would have been quite the investment to go every year. They seem comfortable enough with the journey, so maybe they've gone before, but we don't know how often. And to contrast that to Harry Potter, it's not like the Dursleys accompanied Harry, or, as far as we know, accompanied even Dudley to their school every year. So
Yeah, that would have been quite the trip. And no parents accompany their kids to Hogwarts. Just to the train.
It's interesting, we never actually see Dudley go off to Smeltings. So
yeah, I wonder
that
when
might have been
Smeltings' school year starts. He has a shorter school year than Harry.
Because he's always back by the time Harry gets back,
Interesting. One of the themes that I did notice in this passage was a sense of home and what home is for different people and what home means for different people. Because Jesus is pretty clear that home for him is at the temple, is in the house of God. I think we've talked about it before, but it's very likely that Harry's main sense of home for most of the books is Hogwarts.
Yes.
And I was thinking about Hermione's sense of home being probably a library. Like any library anywhere she could go in and feel at home. And Ron would have to be the Burrow, I think, but
yeah. But I think it says something that he's the only one of the trio that really has that sense of home. Because Hermione doesn't have that at home because she doesn't go home that often.
She doesn't go home. She's very different from her parents. She's keeping things from her parents.
Yeah.
Also, we talked about this with John in our Advent episode, but
John the Baptist,
yes. That this is written according to good young adult literature tropes. That unlike John, who doesn't start until he's like 30, Jesus is starting out at the ripe old age of 12.
Good job.
Off on his adventure.
No slacking off for Jesus.
In verse 47, when they're talking about how everyone is amazed at Jesus' understanding and answers, I was like, well, that's easy. Jesus is Hermione. Everyone's always amazed at her understanding and answers.
I'm so glad that Hermione gets her Jesus moment, because Harry gets so many of them.
Yeah, he gets way more than he should. Just because of the way the story's written.
In verse 49, adoption is such a emotionally loaded thing to talk about for a lot of people. But according to pretty much every adoptive parent I've ever met, the "you're not my real dad" moment is something of a milestone. And it's very familiar to a lot of adoptive families. And generally speaking, the aftermath of that moment cements that you really are that kid's real parent. And I hope that Jesus and Joseph got to have that kind of aftermath after this conversation, because Jesus and Mary, I have to imagine, and Jesus and Joseph would have had two very different relationships in terms of that, because it had to be hard for everybody knowing what Jesus was going to go through, but still. But it occurred to me after I thought about that we never see Harry, who yells plenty in the books, and seems very unhappy with the Dursleys for good reason, for plenty of time, but he never yells that at them. He doesn't get to, he clearly feels that they are not his real parents, but he doesn't yell that at them. He doesn't get the cementing of the relationship aftermath, and so I think that's obvious about how his relationship with the Dursleys is different than Jesus' relationship with Mary and Joseph.
Yeah, well, and I wonder, for Harry, I wonder if part of that is because they constantly are telling him that he's not their child.
You're not our kid.
I also wonder, we get the perspective of Harry in the books, but in the Gospels, we get something more of a third-person point of view than Harry really gives us in the books. But when you were talking about the "you're not my real dad" moment, I was wondering what that moment is like for the child, the one who's adopted, because there's so much in that one
Yeah.
statement. There is so much that could be unpacked, and the complexities and emotions around adoption, and like adoption is not like this thing that you get consent for because you're a baby, and so you don't
Yeah.
pick people, and yeah.
Well, if you're a baby when you're adopted.
If you're a
Not
baby,
everyone is.
right? Like if you're a baby when
Yeah.
you're adopted, you don't get to pick, and even when if you're a kid, like there's limits in how much agency you have in
Yeah.
those choices. I was also struck at the end of the gospel. I love the way that Luke always talks about Mary pondering things in her heart. She ponders everything, and unlike when Amy Pond in Doctor Who saves the day by remembering really hard, Mary's pondering really feels active, and a storing away and a preparation for what is to come for her and for Jesus, so that she can tell Jesus these stories later and remind Jesus of all of the stuff that happened before he could even remember, right when he was born and before he was born and when he was growing up.
You know, I have to think, when you phrase it that way, I realize I'm crossing gospels and that can be tricky. But having these things to ponder into her heart, in one of the gospels, Mary actually witnesses the crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And man, if anything was going to get her through that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the Gospel of John.
I think we think of her as being present at all of them. But.
Right, or even if she doesn't witness it, I think we, generally speaking, assume that she's still alive at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So she would have known.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So I was thinking about who might ponder things and treasure things in their hearts. And I think Molly does a lot. And I wonder if Remus does. Like, he's always feels
That
so
seems like
pensive to me. Like when, after all of the time from when he tries to run away from his family and join the trio until when they hear him on Potter Watch, like I can't imagine he's not been pondering and treasuring the advice that Harry gives him to go back to his family. Because then he says, like, you're right.
Well, and even before that, when we meet him in the third book, he's so much more, I think considerate is the right word, and he clearly has had some time to think things through, and he bothers to.
Mm-hmm.
That's big. Sirius is not so good at that part.
Sirius is terrible at that part.
Yeah.
I don't think he ever tries.
I mean, he was an Azkaban for several years, but it's not like he really had freedom of thought at that point, because with that many Dementors around, it's...
Right.
Yeah. In verse 52, we get another Zeugma. Yay! Now, in comparison with our example of a Zeugma earlier we heard that Samuel got taller. In this Zeugma, we do not hear that Jesus gets taller in stature. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just because the Bible doesn't say that something happened doesn't mean it never did.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the Harry Potter books, we never hear about Harry starting to shave. But he probably did.
Or getting a haircut once he starts at Hogwarts.
Yeah, for that matter. He would have needed one eventually. Although it does bring to mind, who on earth would have been the one to teach Harry to shave? Like, Arthur would have taught Ron. Would Ron have taught Harry?
Oh, gosh.
Is magical shaving different? Would the twins have tried? Oh, man, that would have been a terrible idea.
Be hilarious. I could see Percy
Hagrid.
trying.
Yeah.
This is exactly how you do it. And Harry just getting frustrated.
Yeah. Hagrid could have.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking about the things that just because it's not mentioned doesn't mean it didn't happen, my favorite example of that is that Jesus pooped, right? We never talk, like, it's not in the Bible that Jesus goes to the bathroom, but
yes.
part of being human is pooping, and so Jesus pooped.
Yeah, I've had some really interesting conversations in coffee shops with people who were trying to convert me to Christianity after they found out that I was a woman and either, seeking or had already become a pastor. Because clearly if you're in favor of female ordination, you're not the right kind of Christian.
Which is not what we believe.
Right. I had a similar conversation about Jesus as a teenage boy and probably going through things teenage boys do go through, and got called a blasphemer. So that was a fun moment.
Yeah, and people have gotten upset just at the insinuation that Jesus pooped, let alone anything else. And it's like,
right.
Really? Like, what do you expect to happen?
let's not try to protect God from the difficulties and, ugly parts of life, because that's why God came here to be one of us in the first place, which is what Christmas is about.
Yeah.
Dang it. Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Our next set of readings is for the name of Jesus.
Name of Jesus is, again, a special commemoration that happens on January 1st. In Jewish tradition, naming happens at the circumcision, which is likely where the Christian tradition of naming at baptism comes from. For those who don't know, circumcision is a ritual in which the rabbi removes the foreskin from babies who are assigned male at birth.
Our first reading is from Numbers chapter 6, verses 22 through 27. The children of God received God's blessing through Aaron in what is now known as the Aaronic benediction, which we often hear at the end of worship as we are sent out into the world, changed and marked by God. Now that's the Aaronic benediction and not the ironic benediction.
Oh my gosh.
No ironic benedictions in the Bible.
I want ironic benedictions. Somebody should...
That sounds like the most fabulous clergy cover band name in the history of the universe.
That's brilliant. Also, if you have any ironic benedictions, right? We've talked about blessings, and we already asked you for blessings, but, like, ironic ones, those work too.
Yes.
When I worked at camp, we had this thing that we learned at the beginning of the year, of the summer, every summer, called laser beaming. And so the idea behind laser beaming is that when we're being complimented, a lot of times if someone starts out with good job or something like that, we put our head down and look down, and then we don't hear the rest of what they're saying and what they're actually talking about. And so laser beaming flips the formula and says, hey, I noticed you did XYZ. That really shows that you care, or that you want to do your best, or that justice is important to you, or whatever it shows. Thanks, or good job. And so it just flips that.
Sure.
And so then right when we learned that during staff training, after that, every time we would just laser beam each other, and sometimes it got pretty ironic and sarcastic. And not with kids, right? With campers, it was always a real and serious thing, but it was just kind of a funny and ironic benediction.
Well, I spent some time as a camp counselor or assistant camp counselor, and I occasionally got a little ironic or sarcastic, but only with the older kids.
Right. Yeah.
At the end of the week, you get to a point with the 15-year-olds where you could go there. But, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, blessing comes up again. It's interesting how often blessing is coming up in this episode.
Sure.
But this is the one where I actually found some blessings, and you, I think, alluded to it in earlier.
Yes.
But the blessings that we do find in the Harry Potter books are in Deathly Hallows, when Hermione and Harry are going to Godric's Hollow, and then they go to see his home. They discover his home, which has been preserved for magical folk and is invisible to muggles. And as they are looking at it, Harry reaches out and just grabs the gate fence thing, not to go in, but just to touch a piece of his home.
Right.
And when he touches it, this sign comes up that says what the house is and that sort of thing. And on the sign, there's stuff written all over it, and it's things like, good luck, Harry, wherever you are, or if you read this, Harry, we're all behind you, and long live Harry Potter. And that was just this beautiful blessing and benediction for him, right? This beautiful,
yeah,
we are with you, we are sending you with us. And then the other blessing, right, is Remus' blessing, which we've talked about earlier in this episode on Potter Watch, where Remus says that he would tell Harry, we're all with him in spirit, said Lupin, then hesitated slightly. And I'd tell him to follow his instincts, which are good and nearly always right. And it's this
And I have to say, I love, it is so Remus to say nearly always right. He knew James, he knew Sirius, he was not going to say always right, he knew better.
Yeah.
But nearly always. Yeah, he can go that far.
Mm-hmm.
When we get to verse 22, this part feels like Hermione speaking to Harry before all those Dumbledore's army meetings when he was so nervous, and she was telling him what to say. But it's always the fact that it's Harry saying it that gives it that punch to it, that he's the one encouraging the members of the DA, and after all he's gone through. And so this bit where Aaron is being encouraged to speak, that very much reminded me of that.
Mm-hmm. I also thought about, because we've talked about McGonagall being the high priest of the books,
Right.
At least as far as the teachers go, and wondering about McGonagall's blessings, if she blesses Harry or has benedictions for Harry.
I kind of think that "have a biscuit, Harry" is sort of like a blessing. It's not about the biscuit. It's not about the cookie, but just reading those words on the page, even before you get to Dame Maggie Smith being cast as McGonagall, you can hear the tone of voice, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I have totally used that tone of voice in my real life, of a certain amount of exaggeration, but also there's compassion there, and by saying "have a biscuit, Harry," she's giving him a blessing. She's saying, you can keep going. It's gonna be, well, it might not be okay, but you're not alone. We're with you. I can at least give you a biscuit, and I recognize that this is hard. And sometimes that's the only blessing you can give someone, but it still means a lot, you know?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, as we've been talking about blessings, we keep talking about the blessing and the part of the blessing that is, you're not alone. And I think, especially, I mean, right? It's about God bless you and keep you, God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you, God look upon you with favor and give you peace, right? God's presence with you.
Yeah.
And that I don't think you can do a blessing without some sort of companionship being involved, whether it's...
I mean, at the very least, it's you and the person you're blessing, right? Or you and the person blessing you.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, God being involved means, and that's a huge part of my own personal piety. A large part of my understanding of Christianity is that no matter what happens, I'm not alone because God is with me.
God is always with us all. Also, as you were talking, I thought of another place that there are blessings. In Order of the Phoenix, after Harry's story, an account of what happened comes out in the Quibbler, Umbridge has already made it that students and teachers can't talk about things outside of their class subjects, and then bans the Quibbler article, thus ensuring that everyone reads it. And so the professors can't openly support Harry or affirm what he's doing or anything, and so like they all give him points. So like Professor Sprout gives him like however many points for Gryffindor just for like passing a bucket, and it's hilarious because it's those like little blessings for him, of you're not alone, and of affirmation of who he is and his story and his experience.
Yeah. In verse 25, we read, making God's face shine upon you. And this reminds me of when Harry sees his parents, whether it's in the Mirror of Erised or the various spells and memories. When Harry's parents know that they're looking at him in any part of the story, either as a baby or when he's older, through the mirror or their spirits, their faces always seem to be shining in the movies, and even I think in how they're described in the books, even if not quite using those words. And I think that's a lovely illustration of what may God's face shine upon you sounds like. May God look at you like James and Lily look at Harry.
Oh, that's a beautiful blessing.
I think so, yeah. So if you ever needed to better understand what that phrase in the Aaronic blessing means, everybody deserves to have people who look at them like that, you know? And God always will, even if no one else does.
That's so lovely. Yeah, I've never thought about it that way, and I love that. Verse 27, God names God's own name as being put on the Israelites. And so I was thinking about name, and frequently name actually also means reputation. in biblical terms. And so God's name on the Israelites is that God is connecting God's own reputation with the reputation of the Israelites. And so then I was thinking about different names, and the only name and reputation kind of thing that really comes up is school names and reputations, and then, of course, which house you're in and the reputation of that house comes up, especially
Right.
for Slytherins. But
Durmstrang.
yeah, that was an interesting, like, the way that names are connected to reputation in both books.
Yeah.
Our second reading for Name of Jesus is from Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. There's also another optional reading, but we chose to do Galatians because we haven't done this one yet. So the author of Galatians celebrates the incarnation, God being born in humanity, so that humanity may join with Jesus as children of God. So the big theme for me was incarnation and humanness, right? The ways that God chooses to be really, really human. God chooses all of humanity, from the poops to death and scars and all of that.
Yes.
And it...
Some of it's serious, some of it's not. Seriously.
Seriously. So good, so good. So that the ideas around humanness and what it means to be human reminded me of the way Voldemort's death especially is portrayed in the books versus the movies. So in the books, Voldemort dies a human death because he's human, right? Like Harry even mentions that both his and Bellatrix's bodies are in the like side chamber where the champions went after announcing the Triwizard Champions. And yet in the movies he like crumbles to ash and floats away, and I was like, there are a lot of issues I have with that last movie. Probably the biggest,
and I think you've mentioned this one before.
I don't know if
in previous episodes
mentioned this one. I know I've mentioned issues with it, but like that's my biggest issue with that whole 8th movie is that Voldemort stops being human.
Right.
And that's not right because he is a human. And he lives and dies as a human despite all his attempts to be otherwise.
When we take evil and we turn it into a horrific monster, we forget that means that evil can live in us too.
Mm-hmm.
If Voldemort stays human, it reminds us that he was a person. He started out like other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With respect to actual verses, the verse 4 and the idea of the fullness of time really gets me. I love diving deep into the nerdiness of kairos versus chronos as the two words for time in Greek. And I will spare you all that unless you ask for that, and then I will gladly tell you in comments.
One is God's time, and the other one is just, the tick-tock of the clock.
Mm-hmm. And so thinking about like God's timing and coincidence and the things that appear to be coincidence in life or in the books. And I mean, the Harry Potter books are filled with those coincidences, those fullness of times where how convenient that the Sorcerer's Stone doesn't show up at Hogwarts until Harry's there, or that Harry just happens to learn how to defend himself from Patronuses right before he needs to defend himself from 100 Patronuses. And
defending himself from Dementors with a Patronus.
Yep, that's what I meant. Defend himself from Dementors with Patronus. And I mean, part of it is just the like nature of writing a book, that you have to prepare the characters for like the things that are going to take place. And so that's like the convenience of authorship and the necessities of being an author. But it was just kind of funny to think about all of the different ways that like Harry discovers the Mirror of Erised before he has to use it. And
also, when we read the Harry Potter books, it's pretty clear that Dumbledore is acting in his own time and not Harry's, or for that matter, the time of reasonable human beings who wouldn't leave a child in an abusive home for multiple decades, right? When we reach verse 5, and again we're talking about adoption, it seems pretty obvious in Harry Potter that the Dursleys don't fully adopt Harry. Legally speaking, I'm not really sure what their status is. It's clear that they're his legal guardians.
Mm-hmm.
But and I know that not all adoptions, even with as young as Harry was, involved changing the child's surname. But they seem to refuse to call him theirs in so many different ways, as many as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas our relationship with God is the exact opposite. That God calls us gods in as many ways as not humanly possible, as godly possible, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I hesitate to wonder what to call the Dursleys besides being his aunt and uncle. Legal guardians is the best I can come up with. I'm definitely not going to call them foster parents because most foster parents I've met are a great deal better than the Dursleys ever were.
Yeah, I think legal guardian.
And I think that, yeah, the impersonal nature of the phrase legal guardian gets across what they're doing.
Yeah, they're trying to be as hands-off.
Yeah. They are not quite willing to let their neighbors know that they would let their nephew starve. So.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the Dursleys, I think in verse 7 where it talks about no longer being a slave and the shifting roles from slave to child, and if child, then heir,
right.
reminded me of the ways that Harry's role in the Dursley family shift every year even, right? He goes from having to fry the eggs for Dudley's birthday breakfast in the second chapter of book 1 to the Dursleys being at first terrified of him, and then he's incarcerated in their house, and then the next year, right, like that each time the ways that they treat him and the ways that they all relate to each other shift pretty significantly until towards the end, like they start to understand that Harry in fact really has powerful people behind him and has people that actually care about him, that will hold them accountable for their mistreatment, at least somewhat.
Yeah. Hashtag failed pedagogy at Hogwarts.
That's not pedagogy at Hogwarts. That's like hashtag failed parent family systems at Hogwarts.
Hashtag failed family systems at Hogwarts. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that hashtag. So many options. Our final reading for this day and also for the episode is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 15 through 21. Following the shepherd's visit, Jesus is circumcised and named on the 8th day after his birth, as Jewish law instructs.
The theme that came up for me for this was ritual, right? Which makes sense because the circumcision is a really important ritual in Jewish tradition. And I was thinking about the rituals in the Harry Potter books, and the first ritual that every magical baby goes through is that their name is written down on this scroll so that they'll be sent letters inviting them to go to Hogwarts. And that was just this beautiful thing of both like the ritual in itself of whatever quill it is that writes it down, but also that it's the name of the child, and the ways that circumcision is also the naming of the child. And
yes,
it's just beautiful.
Yeah. Now, the first few verses of this passage may seem vaguely familiar because, we talked about them in our last episode because they're the end of the Christmas story. But looking at verse 15 through the eyes of what we've been talking about in this episode instead of through the eyes of Christmas, I wonder, did anyone go to Godric's Hollow in the immediate days after James and Lily's death in the way that the shepherds went to Bethlehem?
Mm-hmm.
I know that later on we get the sign and there's all those messages on it and such, but we don't know how long that took.
Yeah.
But
well, and we know that Sirius went, and we know that Hagrid went, but yeah.
Right.
I can't imagine
and I think,
wouldn't have
so does that make Sirius and Hagrid the shepherds of... That really does suit Hagrid.
Yeah, and Sirius, I think.
Somewhat, yeah.
Even though we've already discussed in our last episode that Stan Shunpike is the shepherd of the...
Right, yes.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
But I wonder if, like, the neighbors, they celebrated the boy who lived so much. Did some people wander over to the house and just take a moment?
Yeah. Well, and Snape also, at least in the movies, we have a picture. We see Snape grieving.
Yeah. But that's not, he didn't go because of Herod.
Right. Yeah.
I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Like the shepherds went to Bethlehem. You know, that's what Snape did is different.
Yeah. I feel like at least Bathilda would have gone because she knew them.
Yeah.
But she also lived there.
Yeah.
So when as they like head away, glorifying and praising God, I thought about after Remus's, especially first Defense Against the Dark Arts class, the ways that everyone was praising, right, glorifying and praising his teaching, partly because they'd had such abysmal professors their first 2 years,
right,
but also just that he's a really good, solid Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. And so they had a great
finally
class.
Someone competent. Yay!
Yep.
Yeah. I have occasionally had moments like that myself in my history of schooling.
And like we talked about earlier, so Jesus was not born in a stable, but probably, and we'll link to this article, but was probably like born surrounded by a variety of people because they were in the like extra space where all of the family guest rooms were taken up, and so they were in like, you know, like a lot of people do at Christmas time where you like all pack in and there are like 5 people on a couch and that sort of thing. We're continuing that tradition. But so then I started thinking about it, and it's like we always see Joseph and Mary and Jesus as alone until the angels show up. But I wonder who else was there even in that moment. Who else was there that we don't hear about because they're not the main people and the main focus of the story. And so then I was thinking about like all of the other students and the way, right, like who else was in the Marauders dorm? Who else was in Harry's year that we just don't hear about at all? Like there are some that we hardly hear about.
The other 2 girls in Hermione's dorm.
Right? Yeah. Who were they?
And finally, verse 21. Circumcision implies that there is a religious leader, or at least someone with some training, you would hope, involved in this. And I guess it's never occurred to me to ask before, but I do kind of wonder who circumcised Jesus. I mean, they were in Bethlehem. They didn't take him to the temple. That's a ridiculously long journey for a recently having given birth Mary to make. So instead, it almost certainly would have happened in Bethlehem. You would hope that they would have stuck around at least that long to let her recover. But we don't hear any more than just this one verse about that, so we don't know who that was. With regards to the Harry Potter books, I kind of wonder, in assuming, of course, that Harry was more the Christian tradition, I assume that if he was Jewish, we would have heard about it. I wonder if he was baptized. Would the Dursleys have assumed that James and Lily hadn't had that done and gotten it taken care of as just a checkbox to fill out? I've had several conversations with colleagues about the tendency in American culture for baptism to not so much be a religious ritual as just the thing you do with a new kid and to make the family happy.
Or fire insurance.
Yeah,
Lutherans don't believe in baptism as fire insurance.
Yes.
God's grace is bigger than
specifically that. Hell. Right. So I don't know whether the Dursleys would have done that. Were the Dursleys members of the Church of England? I mean, I assume that they... there's a standing joke in Britain, from what I understand, that there's a large section of the population who are technically members of the Church of England. They don't go to church, but when they don't go to church, it's the Church of England that they don't go to. So that sounds like the Dursleys to me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. We will be together again the next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for Epiphany and the season after Epiphany, which include the baptism of Jesus.
This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, HP@church. Or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes or get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. And don't forget to let us know what your ironic benedictions are.
And any zeugmas that you find in the Harry Potter canon.
Mm-hmm.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
Pax vobiscum.